Hi everyone, it's Roxy here. I'm really excited to be hosting our first proper interview for the podcast today. As you know, Al and myself do a lot of research before we dive into a topic, but we're not experts on things and we can only do so much research before it goes live. So today I am joined by the amazing Professor Diane Purkiss, who is an expert on one of these topics we're talking about today. Diane, if you'd like to introduce yourself and sort of a bit about your specialism and what you know all about.
First thing to say, Roxy, is thank you very much for having me on the podcast, and especially in connection with what for me has been a fascinating topic for many years. Just institutional affiliation. I'm a professor of English literature at Oxford University and fellow and tutor in English at Keble College. I got interested in fairies a really long time ago when I first encountered a summary version of Midsummer Night's Dream in a childhood girls annual. And I was, wow, fairies, yeah, but this is amazing. And nobody could tell me where the idea of fairies came from. And I kept thinking of fairy tale stories and wondering what the connection was there. I could think of the good fairies in Disney and the fairy godmother, but they weren't the same as the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream, which seemed much darker and weirder. And I think it's fair to summarize my interest in fairies and the work I've done on fairies as a pursuit of that childhood fascination with the idea that there's something they're not telling us about fairies. There's some aspect of the fairy realm that's darker and in many respects more adult, more sophisticated, more complex than the kind of fairy that you're handed as a little girl.
Yeah, absolutely. That was something me and Al talked about, where they were very helpful, beautiful little creatures, majority of which were girls, and they were just seen as absolutely benevolent. They were happy as anything, very there for us. And as I grew up, it became very apparent, well, that's not all of these entities and these things.
No, that was exactly my experience, Roxy. That I mean, of course, we're all encouraged to identify as little girls with these sort of clean, neat, helpful, pretty fairies. But I thought, well, wait, Puck's a fairy too. And Oberon and Titania are fairies, and they don't seem nice in any kind of ordinary way of nice. So I thought, okay, I don't get this, because it's Shakespeare. You have to believe that Shakespeare is in the know, that he's not just making some kind of fundamental error. So I just think it's so interesting that, I mean, what I've learned since, obviously, is that this is what happens with folklore, that something that's quite wild and exciting, something that's quite radical, often gets kind of tamed in the process of becoming saleable, or the process of becoming, I think I want to say infantilized, turned into something for children.
Absolutely.
Notwithstanding the fact that it's not what children want, it's what adults want for children. And so it actually is the case that both you and I noticed that what happened was that the edges had been sort of planed down and sanded, so that what resulted was something much more smooth and something much less compelling.
Absolutely, yeah. I realised as well quite quickly that although these fairies were very fun to read about and interesting, I'd much rather be a witch and make potions in the garden.
Absolutely, a perfectly reasonable conclusion.
Yes.
And perhaps if you had been a witch making potions in the garden, you might have met a more interesting class of fairy as well.
Potentially, who knows? What is your favourite account of a fairy, whether fictional or a real witness account? What's your favourite one that you've heard?
I'm torn between two, but I'm going to force myself to choose in the interests of brevity. I'm going to talk about my very favourite Scottish witch, Andrew Mann. This was a guy who was arrested and charged with witchcraft as part of the Aberdeenshire witchcraft panic in 1597. And he was what was regarded a wandering magician, a travelling magician. So we assume, it's very difficult to reconstruct exactly, but we assume that he drifted around in the Aberdeenshire area offering magical services to people, a bit like a wandering tinker. But what was interesting was the way he explained the origin of his magical capabilities, which included the power to heal and also the power to manage kind of arable land and agriculture beneficially. And he said he got them from the Queen of the Fairies, or as he called her, the Queen of Elfame, who he said had been his lover for 20 years and with whom he'd had very many children. He first got introduced to her by his mother, when his mother, who was a midwife, attended the Queen of the Fairies in childbirth, and their relationship took off from there. And he confidently explained that he had been to Fairyland many times under her aegis and as introduced by her, where he'd met many dead people, including the king that died at Flodden, James IV of Scotland, and Thomas the Rhymer. So that was his account of a fairy encounter. And for me, what's exciting about that is that it portrays the female as in control, and that's very often the case in fairy stories. Fairies are kind of a matriarchy. The Queen of the Fairies is actually really central to ideas of the fairy realm, and also he sees himself in a subordinate role to her. He doesn't see himself as trying to kind of conquer her or manage her or put her back in her place. But he does make it clear that she is neither an evil, wicked sorceress nor a totally benign, fluffy fairy in a flower fairy costume. Instead, she's sexual, she's adult, she's a matriarch. And so I think that's why it's my favorite encounter.
Yeah, it really puts the idea that we have these tiny, almost childlike fairies in a completely different context.
Absolutely.
It brings to mind actually a book I've read recently, The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss, but the main character in that also has a similar encounter where he's whisked away to another land and loses time to a wonderful woman there who bestows on him gifts and more knowledge as well. So that's an interesting connection there.
That reminds me a lot of George MacDonald's book At the Back of the North Wind, where the North Wind is again a female matriarchal figure who carries away a little boy called Diamond. He's sick, and actually it heals him to be kidnapped by her. But she is darkness, death, and cold as well. So it's got overtones of the Snow Queen as well, who's
really
arguably a similar kind of figure. So I think what draws me to this kind of version of the Queen of Elfame is how absolutely socially radical it is to think with the idea that alongside us sits a realm of very powerful beings that are actually much more feminist-centric than the human realm.
Absolutely. And I think as well that ties into almost the idea that fairies exist beyond the gender binary as well. It challenges this idea of womanhood, but also then what would a man look like in that world as well? Because I know a lot of the time Puck as a specific character is often then shown as being maybe neither here nor there in terms of gender, which is really interesting. I don't know if that's
a little bit gender queer, as people say nowadays.
Yes.
And again, that's quite common with fairies.
I know in your previous interviews and in your book, you said that there are specific types of fairies. And I just wondered, what's your favourite type if you had to have a favourite type?
My favorite type of fairy is the household fairy, usually called a hob or a brownie. They have lots of names right across Europe. In Northern Europe, they're called Nissa. In parts of Russia, they're called Domnavi. They always have the same kind of character. They will help you with the housework and do the sweeping for you, but they are also, in some respects, hard to manage because there are so many prohibitions associated with their help. If you praise them, they leave. If you thank them, they leave. If you give them clothes, they leave. And you have to give them, typically it's once a year and usually on 12th night, a bowl of food that, again, is rigorously policed. So in the British Isles, the normal food gift is a bowl of cream, and woe betide you if you try and palm them off with skim milk. I don't know how they'd take to non-dairy milk. It's an interesting question. In Scandinavia, you have to give them rice pudding, and it has to be this incredibly lush Scandinavian rice pudding, if you've ever had it, which has butter on the top.
Oh, it sounds really good. I've seen quite a few stories, actually, like witness accounts that were even reported in the news down here, where fairies have sort of had quite a lot to say when it comes to the subject of butter as well. And we talked a couple of episodes ago about a mushroom type called fairy butter as well. So clearly dairy products and the fairies, there's a connection there somehow.
Definite affinity, I agree. But what I really like about these guys is the concept, again, sort of really getting away from that deeply unattractive idea that we often find in conceptions of witchcraft. The woman's role is reproductive, and after it's reproductive, it's keeping the house clean. I mean, I like the idea of having a fairy that works for us,
Yeah,
rather than the other way around, if you see what I mean. Even though
absolutely.
they are difficult, I actually quite like their outsiderness, the fact that they're hairy, the fact that they're actually a little bit like domestic pets. The accounts of them usually remind me of my cats. They're difficult and capricious in the same way my cats are.
I've had a cat before, and she was very much a law unto herself.
Yeah, and God help you if you give a cat a food that it doesn't like, it will just reject the food and you.
You mentioned quite a few times you seem to be equating a lot of witchcraft with being a fairy as well. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. In both England and Scotland, there are strong associations between witchcraft and fairies, but they're of different kinds. In England, the association is through the uniquely English figure of the witch's familiar.
Yep.
This is a small demon that's capable of metamorphosing into different animal shapes, but small animal shapes usually, like a rat or a cat, or in one case, a fly. And the witch sends that small familiar demon out to do her witchcraft. The demon is therefore the agent of her magic. So if she wants to make someone sick, she sends the fly to sit on their forehead, or she sends the rat to bite them. I suspect, and this isn't my own idea, this is an idea I'm going to attribute carefully to the wonderful work of Emma Wilby, a fantastic fairy researcher. Emma Wilby suggests that very many of the accounts we have of the behavior of witches in relation to familiar demons are very reminiscent of the accounts we also have of the behavior of housewives towards household fairies. So we have many accounts of women giving their familiar demons a bowl of milk or a bowl of cream, or feeding their familiar demon on a luxury dairy type food like butter. And so Emma suggests, and I think it's a brilliant insight, that these small hairy animals are being reinterpreted by the legal system as demons and therefore as animalistic, when what the women are talking about is a household brownie or hob.
And I think that makes sense as well, because I know during the English Restoration, they categorized fairies as a type of demon as well.
Absolutely.
And that was
exactly what reformers do. Because
Yeah.
after the Reformation, all shades of grey disappear from the cosmos. Everything is either a demon fighting savagely against goodness, or the good fighting back against the dominant demon. And there's no kind of intermediate figures anymore. It's just a very sort of dirigiste idea of how the universe works. So various categories of being or activity that were once okay in a kind of grey area, wouldn't have been approved by the church, but were kind of tolerated, become absolutely interpreted as demonism. And one wonderful example of that is exactly the idea that fairies must be devils. And this also applies to the Scottish model, where Scottish witches also have to do with fairies. And the fairies typically, rather than doing the magic for them, like English familiars, actually teach them magical skills, as I was saying about Andrew a minute ago. So I think it's quite interesting that there's two different models here, but both are contingent on a relationship with these sort of neither good nor evil, but very powerful fairy entities.
I think that's really interesting as well, because in Wales, there wasn't such a big movement with the witch trials, for example. It was, I think there was 5, actually a lot of ministers within the English Restoration. So, for example, Reverend Elias Owen and Reverend Edmund Jones became obsessed with the idea of fairies and actually saw them, as you said, as these powerful creatures that they could classify as demons, but you did not want to cross them no matter what you did. So I think that's really interesting that we've got these strict rules in England and Scotland, but Wales still had its own slightly different idea about them there.
I'm wondering if that's to do with the fact that Wales anyhow resisted Protestantism more strongly, because I'm making a comparison in my head with both Ireland and the West Country, especially Cornwall. Ronald Hutton's idea that regions that retain what we used to call a Celtic type culture, but certainly remain part of a Celtic language family, don't really have a big scale witchcraft persecution in the way that English speaking regions appear to do. So I'm just wondering if, just thinking about the way that the Welsh flocked to the King's banner in the Civil War, just as the Cornish do, whether there's an interesting parallel there, whereby the Welsh, exactly because they're not really buying into the idea that Protestantism is liberating for them, are therefore resistant to the cultural reconfiguration that tends to go with it.
I wonder as well, because obviously with England, yes, we've got hobgoblins and stuff, but a lot of our stories of fairies from England are more of this acceptable whitewash kind of fairy, whereas like I spent 4 years when I was in primary school in Cornwall, and all I ever heard about was the Piskies and how they could be very good, but again, you would need to be careful about them so you didn't end up really annoying them and upsetting them, which wasn't a story I got as much in Northern England, where I spent the rest of my childhood. So
it's really interesting, isn't it? The regional diversity around fairies. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, but maybe some listeners might not be. There's a wonderful book about this called Magical Folk, British and Irish Fairies, edited by Simon Young and Sari Holbrook. And anyone listening to this program that would like to dive deeply into the differences in regional fairy lore, I can't recommend it enough. And Sari is a major folklorist now, and it's been wonderful to see this research unfold and to recognize, I think, perhaps for the first time, how tied into landscape fairy beliefs are.
Yes.
Which makes a lot of sense as soon as you start thinking about the kind of entities that we're talking about.
Absolutely. In fact, even when you were mentioning about flies could be seen as a witch's familiars, it reminded me of an episode we did last season on ghost witches. There's a type of Malaysian ghost witch spirit that specifically deals with sending flies and insects to its victim.
Wow. Ooh, you didn't send one of them.
Yeah, it's a horrendous, it's very scary, but yeah, it's an interesting thing that there's another culture so far removed from our own where witches have that as another familiar in this form as insects. Again, winged creatures almost. So that's a stretch, but interesting there, yeah. In the research I conducted for our first episode this season, it seemed to suggest that fairy, in terms of the etymology, comes from the Latin word fata, meaning fates.
Yeah.
And I just wondered whether you thought this could imply what the fairies can do for humans or what their abilities or powers were.
I think there's definitely a conceptual link that's partly retained because of that etymology. And we see that particularly clearly in Shakespeare's Macbeth, where the witches in Macbeth are actually referred to as fairies in Holinshed's Chronicle, which is Shakespeare's source. So that's an interesting kind of derivation. And the reason for that is that their function in the drama is actually to predict the future.
Yeah.
Indeed, it's because of them and their future predictions that Macbeth embarks on his career of crime. And we often see in other areas that one of the powers that fairies can confer is what is usually phrased in the Scottish witch trials as the ability to see and know all things.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's called
Second Sight.
That's what I'm thinking of. Yes, Second Sight. That's the one.
Yeah. And I think there's actually, yes, a very powerful connection between this idea that the fairy realm exists alongside us, fairies exist alongside us in a kind of veiled way. They're there, but we don't see them. We're not conscious of them. We don't touch them, but suddenly they can reveal themselves to us. And there's a connection between that idea and the idea of the past and the future, also lying alongside the present, but also potentially capable of being suddenly revealed. And so the kind of entity that can slip between worlds is understood as the kind of entity that can also reveal the nature of the past and the future. There's a Scottish witchcraft case where the fairy in question confers the power on the woman to tell who the father of people's children is.
Oh, that's very specific.
Yeah, it is obviously a bit awkward. She actually does a bit of embarrassing blushing. But it's also really interesting because it suggests a power to tell a secret in the past, just as a power to tell what's going to happen in the future is part of the fairy repertoire. The guy who really gains from the prophetic powers of the fairies is the aforementioned Thomas the Rhymer. The fairy queen kidnaps him. Again, he's one of those guys like Andrew Mann, and she doesn't want to start a book club with him. She demands that he serves her for 7 years.
Yeah.
And service means what it sounds like. But at the end of 7 years, she releases him and she gives him a gift that he hasn't asked for and, in fact, tries to refuse, which is the tongue that can never lie. And this is interpreted as the ability to prophesy. So if you ask him a question like, are the Scots going to win the battle? He is only capable of saying the true answer.
Yeah, it's that double-edged sword again, which is considered to be quite connected to fairy gifts, isn't it? You get something you want, but you have to either be very careful not to misuse it, or it come back and bite you in the bum, essentially.
Absolutely right. No, exactly that. So he ends up as a famous prophet, and his prophecies are actually printed, and they're actually banned under Henry VIII.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because they imply a change of dynasty. And other fun fact, there's actually a guy in Northern England who's arrested for having them in his house.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
Henry was pretty tyrannical, I think we have to face.
well, yeah, he certainly had his own way of thinking about things.
My overall sense is that the powers the fairies conferred on ordinary people were a get out of jail free card to some
Yeah.
extent, in that, you know, you're living a fairly boring life in your village. You don't have many opportunities because your father is nobody in particular, but you get touched by fairy magic and suddenly everybody wants to know what you think.
That's really interesting. That feels almost like the trope in sort of dystopian novels of like, you are the chosen one.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
But it isn't always great, right? Because being the chosen one also comes with, you know, oh, the authorities have noticed me.
Yeah. Oh no, you mean I've got to take over the world?
Yeah, absolutely. But it is very much that kind of role.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, yeah, I think there is an interesting ongoing connection, therefore, between fairy power and the power to prophesy. That means that they stay on the register of the authorities to a certain extent.
My next question kind of ties into that, actually, about this idea. Do you think that the fairies were real, or were they a social message for the people of the past? I know it's
Are you asking me if I believe in fairies?
A little bit.
Okay. The short answer is I am agnostic about virtually everything.
Yeah.
I have never seen a fairy. Every single time I've given a talk on fairies, somebody has come up at the end and told me they've seen one. In terms of this period, even if they're real, I think what I've mostly seen in the accounts is that they are the whole concept, the stories associated with them, the things that people want to say about them, all that is doing social work.
Yeah. What kind of social work do you think it was there for?
I think fairies often represent things that are difficult to say out loud. An example I was going to give is the changeling myth.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Which is the idea that your baby has been taken away and replaced by a fairy baby. And typically the fairy baby, the changeling, will be much less cooperative. It will scream all day. It will fail to thrive. It will look a bit odd. And you feel it's no longer your child.
Yeah.
Well, and I've had 2 children, and I'm going to be very honest with the audience here. I think there are times when every mother feels that way about her child. And a big part of that harrowing process and the pain that it causes, I think, comes from a human good, which is a sense of responsibility. When we hear a child crying, our hearts kind of go out to them and we're desperate to help and desperate to fix them. And if we can't fix them, a huge mixture of pretty toxic feelings arises, you know, rage and discontent and a sense of failure and a sense of misery. And how much more would that have been the case in a period where there were no GPs and no nurses and no casualty departments, and where the people that you were likely to be able to consult were probably quite judgmental? So, I mean, in a period where really your chances of your child making it to the age of 10 were massively lower than they are nowadays. The moment when your child cries inconsolably must have been even worse.
Yeah.
And so I think the changeling myth is about that. Actually, it's about the feelings that a mother has, particularly a mother, though it could be a father as well, at that point where the child is miserable and you don't understand why and you can't help.
In the research we've done so far, we've not actually found a lot of stories about men being affected by the changeling myth. It's all been about the woman and the
it usually is the woman, because that's to do with gender and childcare roles. Unfortunately, the story I have about a man being affected by the changeling myth doesn't concern a baby but an adult woman. This is the story of the burning of Bridget Cleary, but in that case it's a wife rather than a child, and I don't think I can quite explain it in the same kind of way. I don't think the psychological drivers would be identical.
Yeah, no, if people are interested in that story, it is in episode 3. We do cover that and the entire timeline. I don't necessarily think that was a changeling. I think it's just straight up murder, but...
Yeah, I think that's quite a likely explanation. And I think it's possible, too, that some of the changeling-related events, such as the exposure of babies on the grounds that they were changelings, might have been infanticide. And let's all remind ourselves that this is a period where there was no abortion. And even if you sort of somehow managed to rid yourself of an unwanted child during the pregnancy, it was often very chancy and involved risking your life. It would
it's very, very dangerous.
Be saner and a bit smarter to wait till it was born and then expose it. And then if you were caught doing so, I suppose the thing you might say is, oh, well, obviously they're a changeling and that's why I'm doing it.
I think nowadays as well, we have to look at these stories through the lens of, was that a child that was just cognitively different as well?
Absolutely, very possible. It's been a suggested neurodivergence.
Because that is something that, as we've understood different children as they're growing up more, we seem to see less and less stories about changelings as we understand the world more as well, which is interesting, I think.
That is really interesting, isn't it? And I agree. One of my children was neurodivergent. And still is, actually, but I'm thinking back to her childhood. And the thing is, we had no idea she was neurodivergent. I didn't see her as a changeling, though, because I'd only had one child. However, I think if she'd been my second child, I'd have noticed it more. So I'm just sort of thinking about what it is that makes us decide that a child is different from the way we might expect a child to be. And nowadays, if that happens, there's tons of support on hand of various kinds. But back in the day, not so much. And I think also infant colic, and this might seem an even dumber thing, but one of the characteristics of changelings is that they cry all the time and refuse food, which sounds awfully like colic. And my experience as a parent is that colic is one of the very most horrifying things that can happen, that isn't actively dangerous to your child. The child will just cry from sort of 4:30 in the evening to 8:30 in the evening, and there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, and it's just must be horrendous. I can imagine
absolutely.
That, if parents even nowadays going, I just don't know what to do, I can't even imagine back sort of 100, 200 years what that must have been like for them.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So I think I'm telling the story of changelings really sympathetically. I think that the story offered women something like an escape hatch where they could be reassured that it wasn't because they were terribly bad mothers, and it wasn't because of anything they were doing. It was because of a strangeness in the child.
How do you think fairies are seen today then? What do you think people nowadays think of them?
I think we now have quite a high hat attitude to fairies, don't we? People like Richard Dawkins, who are kind of permanently skeptical about everything and militantly so, will say, oh, it's a fairy tale, or we'll talk about religious beliefs as the sky fairy. And this is sort of seen as the kind of ridicule that will automatically make you abandon your religion. And there's that. And then on the other hand, there's what I think of as the sort of slightly watered down, rounded off fairies that we still get in Disney films and the like. But I think that in a different category of thinking, there's a lot of interesting revision and darkening. I'm talking here about the romantasy genre, which is definitely having a moment.
Yes, absolutely.
In fact, it's having a big, big moment.
Yeah.
I'm thinking particularly of Sarah J. Maas's work, but there are actually many examples. And all those fairies tend to be on the dark side, actually.
Yes.
When I started working on fairies, my book was published in 2000. It was actually quite radical to say, no, these guys have links with the dead. They're pretty rapey. They've got a lot of supernatural powers. They're dark, nasty fairies. That was considered quite a stretch, really. But now I'm seeing that popular culture has really taken this up and really got the bit between its teeth and has really run with it, which I actually think is great.
Yeah. One of the things I was exposed to when I was quite young was Angela Carter's Book of Fairy Tales.
Right. Yes, of course. The Bloody Chamber. That's definitely the funny side up for sure.
Yeah. And that is a very different form of fairy tales, which you look at and you go, well, hang on a second. They've got, the sisters in Cinderella cutting off their toes and bleeding everywhere. Very, very different fairy tales.
I'm thinking of Emma Donohue's book, Kissing the Witch, which is also an attempt to kind of retell fairy tales with what I suppose what was the subtext suddenly made visible. It's a great book. She's wonderful.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting, definitely. I think you're absolutely right there. Sarah J. Maas is sort of, not her alone, but she has definitely read the book talk world on, oh my gosh, we need to have these shadow daddies and these fairies that are, they're like the vampires of at least my teenagehood, which was like Twilight, and the vampires being these sexual figures of like, oh my God, I love them, I want to be with them. Now it's fairies.
Yeah, exactly. But you're right to make that connection, because actually vampires and fairies are rather similar. Fascinatingly, to me at any rate, fairies in medieval and early modern romances are really much more like Stephanie Meyer's vampires.
Okay.
Than they are like Tinkerbell in Disney's hands. Just that they have bodies. They're clearly capable of falling in love with humans. And when they do, they're really controlling, also like Edward Cullen.
Okay. Do you know what? I'm going to have to look into that more. I hadn't
You want
piece that
there's a
together more.
medieval romance called Sedegare, but very quickly, beautiful lady rides into a wood and gets lost, meets super handsome, unbelievably lovely fairy lord prince who says, happy to help you, and anyway, I've loved you for ages. They ride along together for a bit, and suddenly he says, I'm in love with you, and I want to have sex with you now.
Oh.
And she says, no, I want to go home first. And he said, no, it wasn't a question.
Wow.
And he pulls her off her horse and they do it.
Wow, that is a really intense story as well. It actually brings me back a little bit to Ladies of the Lake stories that we have in Wales of this fairy woman who is like, you Mr. Man, Mr. Shepherd, you're the one.
Come on, absolutely. It's very much the fairy queen in the Thomas the Rhymer tale.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're lying down under the wrong kind of tree, and the fairy queen will show up beside you and kind of go, hi.
Hello.
No, it wasn't a question.
Yeah, this seductress almost, yeah.
Yeah, there's an element of that in Morgan Le Fay in the Arthurian legends, obviously. She's called Morgan Le Fay, Morgan of the Fairies. And then she carries a lot of that weight and authority. And I think one of the really interesting things, therefore, is that there always was quite a lot of mature content in Legends of the Fairies. I think that as well as representing, the human feelings around parenthood that I was discussing, I think they also represent some aspects of human sexuality that are hard to talk about.
And potentially this idea that women can be quite sexual as well, especially back in the past, but that they need their own fantasies and fairy stories in order to have that in a way, which is interesting.
Yes, that's nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
I like that formulation.
What do you think is the connection between fairies and ghosts? What is it? How do they link? I've seen some things about fairies potentially being like the souls of old druids, but it's been quite hard to really nail down anywhere really other than Anglesey, Ynys so...
Unfortunately, it's the case that fairies are very difficult to nail down in general. But my overall, for what it's worth, my overall sense is that Scottish fairies particularly do have an explicitly registered connection with the dead in many, though not all, witch trials. A common pattern that occurs over a number of trials is that a woman will be walking on her own in a particular landscape. Remember, I mentioned their connection with landscape, and will suddenly encounter a man who will identify himself both as a fairy and also as a dead relation of the woman's. Typically, this will be a man who dies untimely, as they say. So in one case, it's a man who dies in the Battle of Pinkie Clough, which is a big battle between the Scots and the English. So it's someone who dies young. Those characters are themselves part of the fairy ride, part of the fairy realm, and they introduce the woman to other fairies. And we see an element of this in the story I mentioned earlier, the story of Andrew Mann, who meets the king that died of Flodden in the fairy underworld, which is a bit unexpected, really, because you'd actually expect a pious Scot to think the king had gone to heaven.
Yeah.
But actually his battlefield death at the Battle of Flodden fits the same kind of narrative as the ancestor who dies at Pinkie Clough. Anyone who dies before their time suddenly is likely to die without having a chance to confess their sins or receive the sacraments. And so they're more likely to be seen as sort of in a kind of limbo space, which is how you could interpret the fairy realm.
Which also then ties in with this idea of babies before they're christened being...
Absolutely right. Yeah, exactly. Babies before they're named, women who die in childbirth, very similar. But there's also an older and more substantive idea than the Christian overlay here. And that is the idea that people who die young have sort of wasted vitality that can be drawn on magically. This in ancient Greek was called the Aoros. It's hard to say. It's Aoros. Someone who died in childbirth, whether it's the mother or the child, or someone who died on the battlefield, was felt to have this sort of life energy that they would have spent living for their full 70 years and 10. But if they don't get to do that, then that magical energy takes another form.
Oh, interesting. So the leftover energy has to get used somewhere in some form.
Yeah, it's a kind of matter can neither be created nor destroyed.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's very cool, isn't it?
Yeah, I really like that as well. So I think my last question I'm going to come on to then is, because I believe you're originally from Australia?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I am still an Australian citizen as well as a citizen of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Good for you. I just wondered whether, Australia had any stories of fairies or anything like this, like the UK has.
It's a really great question because you often have in other colonial contexts, the really famous one is Newfoundland and Canada, a very exact replication of Scottish fairy beliefs there. And wonderful stories there too of people actually leaving for the New World in a desperate effort to escape their household fairy who's been kind of dogging their footsteps and haunting them. But we don't really seem to have that kind of story in Australia. What we really have in Australia is two things. One is what I'm going to describe as maybe a kind of misappropriated version of First Nation Australian, used to be called Aboriginal mythology. And I found that fascinating both as a child and as an adult.
Yeah.
Though I think now one might recoil about the extent to which it's creolized. There is a wonderful book by Patricia Wrightson called An Older Kind of Magic, which I absolutely adored as a child. And it's set in the Sydney Botanical Gardens, which are for Wrightson absolutely rife with the ancient spirits of the land.
Oh, I bet.
Some of which behave a little bit like European fairies. She's quite contentious now because we now have this situation, which we didn't have when she was writing, where it's felt that only First Nation people should tell those stories. But when I was a child, I was grateful that they existed, partly because I connected them in my head with Peter Pan and Kensington Gardens, which was one of my mother's favourite books, in which Kensington Gardens is also full of fairy beings. So, I mean, in a way, what I'm going to suggest is that any fairy beliefs in Australia are heavily creolized. They're a mix of whatever immigrant community, whether it's the English immigrant community, the Irish immigrant community, which is my background really, the Vietnamese immigrant community, and the local kind of and increasingly taught in schools and validated views of First Nation Australians. And very many First Nation Australian myths read and feel to a European like they're telling similar sorts of stories.
Yes.
But we need to be cautious about how we appropriate that.
Yeah, absolutely, of course. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for having this discussion with me. It's been really interesting to speak to someone else who's got a much deeper and specific knowledge on fairies and their kind. And yeah, thank you so much for this. It's been really lovely to speak to you.
Well, it's been super fun for me too, and it's been an absolute delight.
You can find us on Threads, Instagram, Reddit, YouTube and Spotify. Feel free to hit us up on that if you see any videos or posts or anything you'd like us to discuss and explore. Please tag us in it at #Sitnos. That is #SITNOS. We also have our email address of scaredinthenameofscience@gmail.com, which if you have anything you want to tell us about or deep dive into, then please send us an email with some pictures and images so we can take a look.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Thanks everyone.